The pressurized cabin of the private Gulfstream G650 vibrated with a low, expensive hum as it cut through the midnight sky at 40,000 feet, the interior bathed in the pale, sterile glow of ambient blue floor lighting that did little to warm the freezing corporate tension suffocating the room. Grant Sullivan's eyes, heavy with the crushing weight of 4 consecutive sleepless nights, finally gave way to absolute exhaustion, his head slipping sideways and landing heavily, undeniably, against the tailored cashmere shoulder of Rebecca Morgan, the billionaire chief executive officer of Morgan Global. A sharp, collective gasp rippled through the gathering of senior vice presidents as Marcus Vance, the polished senior vice president of strategy, accidentally dropped his heavy crystal tumbler of scotch, the glass shattering against the polished mahogany armrest and sending ice cubes skittering across the floor while Rebecca froze completely, her spine stiffening into ice as she stared down at the low-level financial analyst whose steady rhythmic breathing was now pressing directly against her sleeve, to find out how a single father's moment of pure, undignified exhaustion would expose a multi-million-dollar conspiracy and save a corporate empire from total destruction. Stay until the very end. If stories about quiet, hard-working people who are constantly overlooked by those at the top resonate with your own journey, take a moment to join our conversation in the comments below, as we love hearing from the dedicated members of our community who know what it truly means to sacrifice in silence. It raises a profound question that divides so many modern workplaces, forcing us to ask whether silent endurance and keeping your head down to protect your family is always the noblest path, or if staying quiet for too long simply allows corporate greed to run rampant over the very people who built the foundation. 3 weeks earlier, none of this suffocating tension existed within the pristine, glass-walled corridors of Morgan Global's metropolitan headquarters, where hundreds of employees scurried like ants to finalize the paperwork for a monumental $1.4 billion acquisition of a European logistics conglomerate known as Euro Vanguard. At the center of this storm was Rebecca Morgan, a brilliant, relentlessly high-pressure executive who had spent the last 36 months fighting off a hostile faction of board directors determined to see her fail, her entire legacy riding on the flawless execution of this single contract. Because the board had threatened a vote of no confidence if the acquisition faced even a minor delay, Rebecca had transformed the upper floors into a hyper-efficient war room, demanding perfection from every department and completely ignoring the human cost of her corporate ambition. Down in the dim, forgotten basement level of the data analytics division, Grant Sullivan lived a completely different reality, moving through the shadows as a quiet, composed 38-year-old financial analyst who spoke only when spoken to and never raised his voice, even when younger, credentialed newcomers dumped their overflow workloads onto his desk. What nobody in the executive suite knew or cared to find out was that Grant was a former lead systems designer whose name and historical credits had been deliberately erased from the company's foundational data architecture years earlier after he was ruthlessly framed for a software failure he had actually tried to prevent. He had chosen to remain silent about the injustice, accepting a demotion and a massive pay cut without a single murmur of protest, because his entire world revolved around protecting his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, who had been struggling with a severe, chronic respiratory infection that required expensive specialized treatments. To afford her medical bills and ensure she never felt the absence of her late mother, Grant quietly juggled a second full-time job as a late-night database architect for an overseas logistics firm, a punishing routine that left him surviving on fewer than 3 hours of sleep a night. While the upper floors celebrated the impending acquisition with expensive catering, Grant sat at his dual monitors, tracking tiny discrepancies in the Euro Vanguard ledger that everyone else had dismissed as simple rounding errors. His meticulous nature allowing him to notice a series of peculiar transaction hashes that simply did not align with standard operational routing. Above him, Marcus Vance reigned supreme, a charming, flawlessly tailored executive who used complex corporate jargon to mask his lack of technical competence, always arriving at Rebecca's high-level briefings with polished presentations that stole the credit for the analytical breakthroughs his subterranean staff had produced. Marcus was currently under immense pressure from Rebecca to deliver the finalized financial risk assessment, a document that required an absolute verification of Euro Vanguard's offshore asset pools before the board could officially sign off on the wire transfers. Knowing that Grant was the only analyst capable of dissecting the massive, multi-layered data streams in time, Marcus had personally descended into the basement, using empty promises of future promotions to dump the massive project onto the single father's lap, with a brutal, non-negotiable 12-hour deadline. Grant had merely nodded, his calm, unreadable expression masking the panic of knowing he had promised Lily he would be home to read her favorite bedtime story, his quiet dedication to his duty overriding his personal weariness as he began diving into the endless rows of financial code. For 3 straight days and nights, as Lily's fever spiked and receded in the care of a trusted elderly neighbor, Grant pushed his body past the limits of human endurance, working his daylight hours at Morgan Global and his midnight hours over his daughter's vaporizer, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling slightly as he compiled the final data packets. When Rebecca suddenly demanded that the core analytics team accompany her on an emergency late-night flight to the Chicago headquarters to present the findings to the board of directors personally, Marcus had forced Grant onto the private jet at the last second, wanting his quietest worker nearby just in case Rebecca asked a technical question that his own polished corporate vocabulary could not answer. It was within this high-stakes pressure cooker that the exhausted single father found himself seated directly across from the billionaire CEO, his mind entirely blank from exhaustion as the steady drone of the aircraft engines began to pull him under, his body collapsing into a deep, unstoppable sleep that would shatter the rigid boundaries of the corporate hierarchy. 8 hours would pass before the true, devastating fallout of that mid-air transgression would manifest itself within the frozen walls of the Chicago executive boardroom. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when the elevator doors of the Chicago headquarters opened, the atmosphere inside the executive wing turning entirely hostile as whispers of Grant's mid-flight blunder spread through the ranks of the junior executives like wildfire. Marcus Vance had spent the early morning hours subtly ensuring that every department head knew exactly how an unkempt, lower-tier analyst had compromised the CEO's personal space, framing the incident not as a symptom of human exhaustion, but as a flagrant, disrespectful lack of professional decorum. When the pre-board briefing officially commenced around a massive polished quartz table, Grant sat at the very edge of the room, his face incredibly pale, but his mind entirely focused on the final printed ledgers resting in front of him, having discovered something so deeply alarming during the final hours of the flight that his own personal embarrassment had completely evaporated. As Rebecca Morgan stood at the head of the table, her face a mask of intense determination as she prepared to connect with the international board via video link, Grant calmly stood up, his quiet, steady voice cutting through Marcus Vance's opening remarks, as he stated that the Euro Vanguard acquisition had to be halted immediately. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room as Grant stepped forward, placing a series of data variance reports directly onto the table, pointing out an incredibly sophisticated accounting pattern involving 12 off-balance sheet special-purpose vehicles routing through an offshore shell bank in Cyprus. He explained, with absolute mathematical precision, that these dummy contracts were actively extracting over $240 million of Morgan Global's capital reserves under the guise of technical integration fees, meaning the company was actively purchasing a hollowed-out shell. Before Rebecca could even process the data, Marcus Vance smoothly stepped into the light, a look of manufactured pity on his face as he corporate-worded Grant's findings into complete oblivion, explaining to the room that the exhausted analyst was suffering from severe cognitive burnout, a fact that had been made embarrassingly clear to everyone on the corporate flight just hours prior. Marcus presented a set of fabricated system logs that he had hastily generated, falsely demonstrating that the discrepancies Grant had discovered were actually the result of Grant's own input errors and corrupted data algorithms, effectively turning the single father's brilliant diagnostic work into proof of his own mental incompetence. Rebecca Morgan, facing immense, unforgiving pressure from the board members who were already appearing on the digital screens behind her, looked from the chaotic, fabricated logs to Grant's worn shoes and tired eyes, her judgment completely clouded by the absolute necessity of keeping the deal on track. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the room like a razor blade as she told Grant that his erratic behavior, combined with his deeply unprofessional conduct on the aircraft, proved he was no longer fit to represent the standards of Morgan Global. In front of the entire senior executive team, she demanded his security clearance badge, coldly informing him that his employment was terminated effective immediately, and that he was to be escorted from the premises by building security without entering the main server rooms again. Grant did not shout, he did not plead, and he did not cast a single glance of hatred toward Marcus Vance. Instead, he simply detached his badge, placed it quietly on the quartz table, and gathered his old, scuffed leather briefcase with hands that remained completely steady. As the security guards flanked him, his only thoughts were not of revenge or corporate pride, but of the absolute terror of losing his corporate health insurance policy. Wondering how he would explain to the pharmacy that he could no longer afford the specialized inhalers that kept his daughter Lily breathing safely through the night. For so many of us watching, the pain of being completely misjudged and cast aside by people who never took the time to understand our true sacrifices is an experience that cuts incredibly deep. And if you have ever felt completely unseen or underestimated in your own career or life, we invite you to share your story with our family here in the comment section below. Grant walked out of the towering glass monolith into the biting autumn wind, his head held high despite the crushing weight in his chest, leaving behind a boardroom that believed it had just excised a dangerous liability, entirely unaware that they had just cast out the only anchor holding their entire ship above water. Exactly 14 hours would pass before the first invisible fracture in Marcus Vance's perfect corporate facade would begin to bleed through the automated compliance systems. The clock on the wall of Rebecca Morgan's luxury hotel suite ticked past 2 o'clock in the morning, the vast space cluttered with financial drafts, empty espresso cups, and the oppressive silence of an executive who had achieved everything she wanted but could find absolutely no peace. Despite the fact that the board of directors had finalized their preliminary approval for the Euro Vanguard deal, Rebecca found herself staring at the empty space on her tailored jacket, where Grant Sullivan's head had rested just 24 hours earlier, remembering the profound, unyielding sorrow in his eyes when she had dismissed him in front of the entire company. She recalled how he had never raised his voice, how his presence had possessed a rare, quiet dignity that completely contrasted with the frantic, self-serving sycophancy of Marcus Vance. And for the first time in her brilliant career, a cold blade of intuition told her that she had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Her suspicions were suddenly validated when a soft, frantic knocking echoed through the suite door, revealing Sarah Jenkins, a sharp, 26-year-old junior compliance analyst from the basement division, who was trembling with a mixture of terror and absolute certainty. Sarah bypassed all corporate protocol, stepping into the suite and immediately opening a heavily encrypted secondary ledger on a secure laptop, revealing a hidden data pipeline that Grant had quietly established weeks before his forced termination. Sarah explained that she had spent the entire night tracing the encryption keys Grant had left behind, discovering that the fake overseas contracts were not software glitches at all, but a real-time financial siphon actively preparing to drain $240 million the exact second the final electronic signatures were validated. The undeniable mathematical proof showed that the administrative access codes used to authorize these fraudulent transfers belonged exclusively to Marcus Vance, who had spent the last 18 months setting Grant up as the ultimate scapegoat for the company's impending ruin. Overwhelmed by a wave of profound guilt and horror, Rebecca realized that the man she had publicly humiliated was the only person who had actually cared enough to protect her legacy, while the man she had trusted was actively preparing to burn her empire to the ground for personal gain. Without wasting a single second, Rebecca ordered her driver to navigate through a torrential downpour to the far outer suburbs, her heart pounding against her ribs as the limousine pulled up to a modest, fading two-bedroom apartment complex that felt worlds away from her billionaire reality. She climbed the narrow, creaking staircase herself, her expensive heels echoing in the dim hallway until she reached Grant's door, which opened to reveal the single father, standing under a single, flickering bulb, wearing an old flannel shirt and holding a half-empty bottle of children's medicine. Looking past him, Rebecca saw 7-year-old Lily sleeping peacefully on a small couch beneath a knitted blanket, the apartment immaculately clean, but bearing the unmistakable signs of a family surviving on the absolute edge of financial survival. Rebecca stepped into the warm, small kitchen, her corporate armor completely melting away, as she offered Grant an immediate reinstatement, a quadrupled salary, and the title of Senior Vice President of Global Architecture if he would return to the tower to help her stop the execution of the contract. Grant looked at his sleeping daughter, then turned his calm, unreadable gray eyes back to the billionaire CEO, his voice remaining incredibly soft but carrying the weight of a mountain as he flatly declined the flashy title and the corporate wealth. He calmly stated his real condition for returning. He did not want an executive suite or a corner office. He demanded the immediate, public restoration of his wiped historical credits on the company's foundational data architecture, alongside a legally binding guarantee that the low-level data and maintenance staff would never again be sacrificed to cover the moral failures of the upper management. Before Rebecca could even agree to his terms, her phone violently vibrated with an emergency text message from the board secretary, revealing a terrifying escalation crisis. Marcus Vance had discovered Sarah Jenkins' data breach and had used his emergency administrative powers to move the final board execution vote forward to 6 o'clock that morning. This meant they had less than 3 hours to intercept the international wire transfers before the funds vanished irrevocably into the offshore accounts, and Marcus had already initiated an automated security lockout that would freeze all external administrative access to the primary servers at exactly 5:30. This desperate race against time highlights the profound gap between the flashy, credentialed corporate newcomers who rely on buzzwords and administrative manipulation, and the seasoned, quiet experts whose deep practical knowledge of the underlying machinery is the only thing that can actually prevent a catastrophe when the system begins to fail. Grant did not panic. He simply walked over to his small desk, picked up his worn leather briefcase, kissed his daughter gently on the forehead while whispering to the neighbor that he would return soon, and looked at Rebecca, his quiet posture signaling that the true master of the system was finally ready to step back into the arena. With only 45 minutes remaining on the digital countdown clock, the old elevator doors of the Morgan Global Executive Tower would slide open to reveal a sight the board of directors never anticipated. The atmosphere inside the high-security server room was deafening, the continuous, high-pitched whine of thousands of cooling fans creating an overwhelming wall of sound as Grant Sullivan sat down at the master terminal, his fingers moving across the command line interface with a terrifying rhythmic speed that completely stunned the elite network administrators standing behind him. Rebecca Morgan stood directly over his shoulder, her eyes fixed on the digital countdown clock on the wall, which showed exactly 22 minutes before Marcus Vance's automated security script would completely lock the entire system, permanently authorizing the $240 million international transfer. Grant did not use the standard graphical user interface that the company's modern MBAs relied upon. Instead, he entered the raw, foundational layer of the operating system, bypassing the complex SHA-256 encryption layers by utilizing an undocumented backdoor logic gate that he had personally coded into the architecture 10 years earlier before his credit was stolen. He systematically named the precise technical mechanisms allowed to the compliance team, explaining how he was tracing the double-entry GAAP ledger anomalies, isolating the hidden routing transit numbers via the raw Swift MT-103 messaging logs, and dissecting the automated script that Marcus had deployed to erase the digital audit trail. Upstairs in the primary boardroom, Marcus Vance was standing confidently at the mahogany podium, addressing the gathered board members and urging them to execute their digital signatures immediately, using polished corporate jargon to assure them that the early morning session was necessary to lock in the European market rates before the closing bell. Just as Marcus raised his gold-plated fountain pen to sign the master authorization document, the massive projection screens behind him suddenly flickered, the polished PowerPoint slides instantly replaced by a live, unedited stream of raw transaction data cascading down in crimson letters. The boardroom doors swung open, and Rebecca Morgan marched into the room, followed closely by Grant Sullivan, whose faded jacket and steady, unhurried stride commanded the immediate, breathless attention of every billionaire director in the room. Grant reached the secondary display terminal and executed a final network node override, flashing the explicit routing details across the screens, which showed the exact path of the $240 million, moving directly through the Euro Vanguard shell companies into a private liquidity fund registered under Marcus Vance's personal asset corporation. Marcus Vance's polished composure completely shattered in an instant, his face turning an ash-gray color as he attempted to bluster, using empty corporate phrases about operational optimization and structured tax shielding, but his voice cracked violently, heavy beads of sweat breaking through his expensive makeup as the undeniable mathematical proof pinned him to the wall like a specimen. The board members watched in absolute horror as Grant systematically brought up the historical server logs from 5 years ago, proving not only the current fraud, but exposing how Marcus had systematically forged the documentation that had originally ruined Grant's career to cover up an earlier multi-million-dollar operational deficit. Rebecca stood tall at the center of the room, her voice carrying an absolute, unyielding authority as she revoked Marcus's executive standing on the spot, ordering the corporate security team and the federal investigators, whom she had quietly embedded in the building hours earlier, to step forward and arrest him for grand larceny, wire fraud, and corporate espionage. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Marcus Vance's wrists, his frantic, desperate pleas echoing down the hallway as he was dragged away, a profound, stunned silence fell over the multi-billion-dollar boardroom, every eye turning toward the quiet single father who stood completely still near the back of the room. The central emotional arc reached its absolute zenith as the very board members who had demanded Grant's termination just hours prior now stood up one by one, their hands clapping in a slow, deeply respectful ovation for the man they had written off as completely insignificant. Only 12 days would pass before the public dust from the collapse of Marcus Vance's career would settle, leaving behind a completely transformed landscape inside the highest office of the tower. The grand auditorium of Morgan Global's metropolitan headquarters was filled to absolute capacity, with over 900 employees sitting in breathless silence as Rebecca Morgan stood alone at the center of the illuminated stage, a microphone in her hand and the entire board of directors seated solemnly behind her. She did not deliver a polished, PR-vetted corporate statement. Instead, she looked out into the crowd and openly confessed her own past blindness, publicly detailing how her own obsession with corporate milestones had caused her to commit a profound, devastating injustice against one of the company's truest anchors. She officially announced that Marcus Vance was currently being held without bail, facing 25 years in a federal penitentiary. And then, her voice softening with genuine emotion, she called Grant Sullivan down to the stage, gesturing for him to step into the light that he had been denied for over a decade. In front of the entire company, she presented him with a legally binding contract that officially restored his name to every foundational software and data architecture patent the company owned, ensuring his professional legacy was permanently secure for generations to come, before publicly offering him the highly prestigious position of Chief Risk Officer, with a compensation package that would make him an incredibly wealthy man overnight. Grant stepped up to the microphone, his posture completely unchanged, looking out at the massive sea of faces before turning back to Rebecca with a gentle, appreciative smile that contained absolutely no trace of arrogance or triumph. He calmly and politely declined the high-profile executive suite, explaining to the stunned audience that he had no desire to spend his life attending endless board meetings or managing corporate politics. Instead, he requested the creation of a completely independent internal audit and employee protection division. He explained that he wanted to head a small, quiet office dedicated exclusively to ensuring that the frontline workers, the maintenance technicians, and the entry-level analysts who kept the company running were always protected from executive exploitation, a role that would allow him to leave the office at precisely 4 o'clock every single afternoon so he could pick up his daughter Lily from her school bus. 6 months later, an ordinary rainy Tuesday evening found the upper floors of the corporate tower completely dark and empty, the high-powered executives having long since departed in their private cars, leaving only the soft ambient security lights reflecting off the glass. Down on the mid-level floor, Rebecca Morgan walked down the quiet hallway to the newly established Employee Protection Office, knocking softly before finding Grant Sullivan quietly packing his old, familiar leather briefcase at his desk. On the corner of his desk, framed beautifully in expensive mahogany, sat a colorful, slightly crumpled crayon drawing made by 7-year-old Lily, depicting her father wearing a bright red superhero cape while standing next to a massive, shining airplane. Rebecca smiled, a rare, completely genuine warmth softening her brilliant eyes as she walked forward and handed Grant a small, simple wooden box containing his grandfather's vintage mechanical watch, an irreplaceable family heirloom that Grant had been forced to pawn years earlier to pay for Lily's initial medical consultations, and which Rebecca had spent the last 4 months tracking down across the country. They shared a quiet, meaningful conversation about what true value actually means, agreeing that it was never found within the billions of dollars floating through digital corporate ledgers, but rather within the quiet, unbreakable commitment to protecting the people who depend on you. In a world that constantly rewards the loudest voices, the sharpest suits, and those who are quickest to take credit for the work of others, it is so easy to feel like your quiet dedication, your sleepless nights, and your immense sacrifices are completely invisible to the people around you. But true worth can never be permanently erased by corporate greed or temporary blindness, because like the steady, unyielding gears of a masterfully crafted clock, it is the silent, overlooked heroes who keep the entire world spinning when everything else threatens to fall apart. Has there ever been someone truly special in your own life, perhaps a parent, a quiet coworker, or a dedicated friend, who sacrificed everything in absolute silence, completely misjudged or written off by the world before anyone dared to see the magnificent depth of their character? Tell us their name or share that specific memory in the comments below, even if it is just to finally give them the profound recognition and credit they have always deserved. If you believe that these quiet, overlooked individuals deserve to be seen and celebrated for the true anchors they are, we warmly invite you to subscribe and become a permanent part of our storytelling family here, where we ensure that the most genuine hearts are always brought into the light. Thank you for staying with us until the very end, and we look forward to reading your beautiful tributes in the discussion below.